Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. Today is Sunday, June 2nd, 2024. And for now, I am joined by our current Vice Chairman and Director of Visual Art, Ramon Garcia. We are awaiting our guest, Charlie Painter. He is having a few issues in making a connection. However, in the meantime, I think he is in the progress of joining. I would like to set a bit of the context for our conversation, and you saw Charlie pop in just now, but he reached out to me after a recent debate that I was involved in on Andreas Xerxes's channel, a debate on free will and determinism. And this was quite a lengthy session. It was over 3 hours and 16 minutes long. And I was the participant in that debate who defended a view of free will as entirely compatible with the laws of physics, with material causation, but also not being a situation where the individual is somehow externally determined or forced to make certain choices. So I actually argued for genuine free will, but not from a religious standpoint, not from some sort of supernatural standpoint, but from a materialist standpoint. And Charlie found that argument to resonate with him and his background, his context in the philosophy of Objectivism. He wrote, "I appreciate your contributions in defense of free will, Gennady." And he then wrote, according to Leonard Peikoff, who is one of the leading objectivist philosophers, indeed, Ayn Rand considered him to be her intellectual successor. Philosophy is the study of fundamentals and free will is axiomatic. Also, Ayn Rand said, philosophy is primarily inductive versus deductive a la Aristotle, except for the three axiomatic concepts, which are existence, identity, and consciousness. Consciousness is not matter, but a biological process emerging from a delicate, complex organization of matter. Like the planet Earth, we probably couldn't have carbon-based life on any of the other planets in our solar system, or perhaps anywhere else in our galaxy, due to Earth's precise distance from our sun. The conditions here are just right for complex life forms to emerge. Consciousness exists, regardless of whether we understand every circumstance that allows it to exist as such. Rather, it is the precondition for all understanding. We cannot get underneath it. Also, free will, or free won't, and its relation to morality, and as the premise for an objective legal/court system for existing in a relatively free society, could use more elaboration here. And then he said that he would be honored to be a guest on my channel to discuss music, since he is a self-employed improvising musician, as well as Ayn Rand, Objectivism, and objectivist ethics and morality. So here we are. And a bit more about Charlie Painter. He is a self-studied, self-producing guitarist, teacher, and band leader based in Madison, Wisconsin. You can find a lot of his music on his YouTube channel. So His YouTube channel is Charlie_Painter. And he also has a website, charliepainter.com. If you go to charliepainter.com/music, you can also hear some of his recordings. And some have also asked, is Charlie Painter's music on SoundCloud? And indeed it is. So here is the link to his SoundCloud page. Again, I would encourage all of you to check out Charlie's music. And now, while he's still trying to join, I want to go to some of the viewer comments that have been made thus far. So, first of all, Mike Lazine writes, this is going to be a great virtual enlightenment salon, since he is a self-taught EDM maker and DJ, and I hope you will indeed have a lot in common with Charlie, Mike. So thank you for that comment as well. And Mike also writes that he used to put his music on SoundCloud years ago, and he got annoyed with the cap on uploads. So then he found AudioMac, which has unlimited uploads for free. He has his music on there and on Mixcloud. So thank you for those insights. And again, I hope this is going to be an interdisciplinary conversation where we have a discussion about music, we have a discussion about philosophy, how they interrelate, because I think philosophically informed musicians do produce different kinds of output, often more thoughtful kinds of output that speak to bigger ideas, that speak to the key issues affecting the human condition. And if you listen to Charlie's performances, I think you will clearly hear that from him. Now, Art Ramon, I know you occasionally post some videos with music in it. Where do you get your music, and do you ever dabble in musical creation yourself?
And I once time tried musical creation with, there was a VR program that was kind of like a virtual DJ program, and I was very interested in doing it, but and it had quite a pretty good tutorial, but it was just time. I didn't have the time to completely delve into it. And as I started making videos, I've only been making videos for like not even a full year. I mean, I started using CapCut mostly for a lot of video content creation. And there's a kind of a database you can search there and add music into the video. So, CapCut has its own little database of music. You can add, so does Instagram. So there's one on Microsoft now. There's a Microsoft version of a CapCut, and they also have a list of music you can search through, which they sort of license. So you can't find every single song in the database because I guess it depends on what they license. And but yeah, it definitely, adding music adds a lot to the video, and just makes it more emotional to get that connection with the viewer.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Thank you for those insights, Art Ramon. And of course, I myself am a composer, and you can find all of my musical compositions on my YouTube channel as well, including the versions that were recently remastered by our friend and legislative director, Jason Geringer, who has definitely ventured and explored substantially the software that is now available for remastering MIDI files, for example, and that software is quite impressive. So, Winning Streak asks, what are the values of objectivists? So, objectivism is quite a coherent and extensive philosophy. It was originated by Ayn Rand. And objectivism articulates in the various subdisciplines of philosophy certain key ideas. So in metaphysics, which is essentially the study of existence, the nature of existence, objectivism holds that there is an objective reality that is independent of the observer. So existence exists, and we are in the same existence, you and I. It's not dependent on our consciousness. In epistemology, which is the study of how we know what we know, objectivism supports the use of reason and logic to understand the world. So again, there is an objective set of processes, and the human rational faculty exists to be able to engage in those processes, to understand reality as it is. And again, it's possible for all of us to arrive at the same understanding using that rational faculty that we all have. Then in ethics, which is essentially about what should people do, how should people live their lives, objectivism espouses rational individualism or egoism as distinguished from egotism. So Rand tried to essentially rehabilitate the concept of selfishness, but it's not selfishness in the sense that it has been known throughout a lot of philosophical writings before Rand. It's essentially enlightened self-interest. So you need to pursue your own life as your highest value, and everyone else should do the same. And in the process of doing that, this enlightened selfishness leads to essentially a confluence of interests among everybody. So there's no conflict of self-interests among fully rational individuals who consider all of the implications of their actions. And then in politics, Rand advocated for laissez-faire capitalism. So essentially, she believed that each individual should be free to act on his or her rational self-interest, fully considered, and there shouldn't be external restraints or mandates except insofar as to protect individuals from the initiation of force against other individuals. So clearly, she did not want people to commit crimes. She did not want people to infringe on the rights of others. And her ethics of rational individualism created a foundation for individual rights being thoroughly and consistently respected. Now, Ayn Rand was very much not an anarchist. She believed in the need for government. She believed that government exists to protect individual rights, and she very much admired the American experiment, the political system that was brought into being via the US Constitution. And while she also acknowledged some imperfections of that system, she saw it as the best instantiation of a system for the protection of individual rights that existed up to that point in time. So that's a brief overview of objectivist philosophy. There are, of course, a lot of finer points that could be delved into, but winning streak writes, selfish, I want what I want regardless of others. That's not, though, what Ayn Rand considered to be true rational selfishness. So she didn't say ignore other people. She did say man is a social animal, essentially, and we require other human beings to survive. We require other human beings to maximize our full potential. And the way she advocated for people to engage with others is through what she called the trader principle, Trader, not Traitor. But the trader principle is we trade value for value. So we have something to offer ourselves, other people have something to offer us. We come to a mutual understanding and agreement of what those values are. Now, we have Super Fin Guy, who says Objectivism pretends to use reason and logic, but it is full of fallacies and irrationalities. So I hope that's something we can discuss today a bit more once Charlie is able to connect successfully, because there could be rational disagreements about what some of the implications of objectivism are, and what parts of objectivist philosophy as such are truly universalizable philosophical principles versus Ayn Rand's own personal opinions. So, for instance, Ayn Rand had certain aesthetic tastes, and in some cases, they were good ones. Like, she really admired the music of Romantic era composers, and she liked to listen to Rachmaninoff, for instance, whom I admire greatly as well. And I've listened to all of Rachmaninoff's works. She liked to listen to Chopin, and I have listened to all of Chopin's works as well. But she had some criticisms, perhaps, for composers of earlier eras, like the classical era, which I would not share. I also greatly admire the composers of the classical era. And is that part of objectivist philosophy? Probably not. Probably those were just Rand's personal tastes, and people are entitled to those. Now, Mike Lazine asks, so objectivism means that reality would exist with or without sentient beings? Absolutely. So keep in mind, for the vast majority of our history, sentient beings, as far as we know, did not exist. So before any life arose, there were billions of years in which inanimate matter existed. And on Earth, there were billions of years before animals emerged who could be said to have a measure of sentience. So absolutely, we know from essentially science, from geology, from even the theory of evolution, that there have been vast stretches of time when reality existed without sentient beings. And we humans came onto the scene quite late in terms of geological time, and we are here. We have these remarkable faculties of consciousness and volition, which is the faculty of free will. But for the majority of existence, there were no such entities that we have been aware of. Now, maybe elsewhere in the universe, there were other sentient species, and I can't really comment on when they would have arisen. We don't have enough evidence to opine on that. But yes, very much it is the case that objectivism holds that reality would exist even if we didn't exist, and even if no sentient being existed to perceive it. Now, at that point, of course, ethics would not have any purpose, because rocks cannot have ethical principles, and planets without life on them cannot have ethical principles or goals. Ethics exists for the purpose of living beings. So ethics is objective, though, because ethics is dependent on the requirements of our survival and, in Rand's view, our biology. So our natures as biological but also rational volitional entities necessitate a certain approach to ethics. And again, it is the task of philosophy to figure out what that is. Now, we have another question from Mike Lazine, who wonders, is it a form of liberalism? So liberalism, properly understood, would be a framework that advocates for the liberty of the individual. So we're talking here about classical liberalism, and what that means. It's distinct from modern liberalism, as is often understood in the United States, but classical liberalism advocates for a societal and political framework that respects the rights of the individual. And generally, classical liberals embraced free markets, for instance. They wanted religious toleration, so people could be free to espouse or not espouse any form of religion. And furthermore, people could be free to lead lifestyles that they wished as long as it didn't harm others. So, in that sense, in the realm of ethics and politics, objectivism would be consistent with classical liberalism, but not with 20th century liberalism, which essentially relied on central planning and a large and fairly invasive government to enforce certain norms or expectations within society. And John H. writes, Ayn Rand believed in laissez-faire capitalism until she got old and sick and needed help from the nanny state. Well, she did accept Social Security benefits. I know that. Now, with Social Security benefits, I think her justification for that would be this is a system that exists now and she paid into it. And she was essentially getting back what she paid with interest. And I think for a lot of people, irrespective of their political beliefs, when it comes to personally collecting on those kinds of pension systems, it's a matter of getting back what they contributed. And if you think about, for instance, if you were able to invest that money and you were able to earn a return on that money, you could be in a similar position. It's just, in this case, it was a kind of forced savings program that she didn't have a choice to participate in. And all of us, to some extent, participate in those programs in the Western world, at least. So I think in the minds of many people, it's only fair that you take out what you put in and a commensurate return to what you might have earned if you had invested it. So I don't necessarily see that as being in conflict with her philosophy. Her philosophy was oriented more toward how should the government behave? How should the government structure the systems of this sort, if at all? So she would have advocated, for instance, for a private option. So if people wanted to not participate in that system and instead invest their own earnings, they should be given that choice. So I don't really see a conflict. Francois Joanneau says a nanny state is always needed at one point, and that's where she would disagree. I think she would say that people can take care of themselves through private arrangements, through voluntary charity, even if they didn't make provision for old age or for ill health. And that could, in many cases, be more effective than a government doing it. Francois Joanneau says, but if local communities and or companies become nannies when needed, it's okay. So I think Ayn Rand would not have disagreed with that. She would have said it's the right of private entities to do that if they so chose. So she wouldn't say, no, you shouldn't help other people. Super Fin Guy writes, rational selfishness is an oxymoron. Either you care for others or you don't. Well, it could be entirely rational for you to care for others if you think that they are bringing value to the world. They are bringing value to you, or you like what they're doing, or you admire them for something that they have done. It can absolutely be rational to care for other people. So I think a lot of people misunderstand that aspect of her philosophy, and it has caused some needless criticism. And of course, we can criticize objectivism on this program. I've always advocated for a big tent approach. I don't want to say that objectivism is infallible, because it's not. And primarily it is the product of one individual's thinking. And I think one of the errors that Ayn Rand, especially later in life, lapsed into is thinking that her system is kind of complete with her, and that no further material development or elaboration would be possible. But really, with any system of thought, it needs to adapt to changing times and to new discoveries, new insights, new people being involved in fleshing out key ideas. So I think that's always important to consider. Alan Crowley writes, ethics do not belong to the rocks, but to the people that would throw them. Yes, let's not throw rocks needlessly at other people. So an ethical system can help us to avoid conflict. It can help us to peacefully coexist and derive values from one another. So Francois says, when you get welfare, it's like borrowing to the community. Well, the difference is people are compelled to pay and people then receive out of those compelled payments. So that's where the disagreement would arise. So Ayn Rand, again, wouldn't say no charity, don't help people, but Ayn Rand would say you shouldn't be forced to help people and you should be able to choose whom you help as well. So hopefully that's a helpful distinction. And Francois Joanneau says welfare abuse is the same as credit abuse and fraudulent bankruptcy, should be treated the same, not better, not worse. So that's more of a kind of practical issue. I think a lot of money is needlessly wasted on trying to identify and track down welfare abuse, and it could be better spent in the context of, say, a universal basic income. So I don't know what Ayn Rand would have said about a universal basic income because it does require a government system of distribution. But if it's not funded by taxation, she might be accepting of it. That's my hypothesis. But the problem with today's welfare systems is, of course, because they're conditional, then they're prone to abuse according to the rules of the system. So somebody could claim eligibility to benefits that they're not entitled to under the rules. And then you have to have a bureaucracy to administer the payouts and make sure that people don't cheat. And that bureaucracy costs more money than anything else. So I would say it's important to really consider how welfare systems are funded. It's not just, oh, do you give money to people who are needy? It's a question of, are people required to do that? Or is there some sort of voluntary system? So along these lines, Zoltan Istvan, who, by the way, was heavily influenced by Ayn Rand, and he was the founder of the Transhumanist Party, and he was our first presidential candidate, proposed what he called a federal land dividend. So there are large swaths of unowned federal land in the United States, and the federal government currently is not making much use of it. Sometimes private entities get some rights to use the land, say for agricultural purposes, but it's rare. So the purpose of the federal land dividend is to lease that unused federal land to private companies, and from those proceeds pay a universal basic income, which would over time replace some of those conditional welfare payments. But in the first instance, it would just be an additional payment, like the Alaska Permanent Fund, for example. And it's not based on taxation. It's not based on any sort of compulsion, because it just provides an opportunity to the private companies to use this federal land, and it provides payments to everybody without having this expensive verification of eligibility. So that, I think, is a system that if Ayn Rand were alive today, she died in 1982, we could ask her about, and I would say it's not a foregone conclusion that she would oppose such a system. She would oppose a taxpayer-funded welfare system or universal basic income. So I think there are a lot of misunderstandings about objectivism as well. And while Charlie is still trying to join us, and he is, we can clear some of those up. Now, Alan writes, ironic that classical liberalism supports individuals, but modern liberalism supports groups and individuals only based on their group identity. And yes, that's a problem with contemporary left-wing thought. So classical liberalism would say individuals have rights qua individuals. It doesn't matter who you are, what your gender is, whether you're male, female, what your skin color is, what your religion is. You have rights as a human being by virtue of your humanity. So classical liberals really opposed, for instance, rigid hereditary class systems. They didn't like hereditary aristocracy for the reason that essentially those systems set a few people apart as being privileged over everyone else. And classical liberals said, no, everyone has the same rights as individuals. But classical liberals would not support special rights just because someone is of a certain skin color or because someone is of a certain gender or gender identity. They would say everyone has the same rights. Everyone should have the same opportunities initially, and what they do with those opportunities is up to them. And nobody should stop people from pursuing their legitimate opportunities as long as they're respecting the rights of others, as long as they're adhering to the laws. But also, we shouldn't have, for instance, affirmative action in colleges. We shouldn't have special payments made to people just because they're of a certain skin color. So that is where classical liberalism differs from modern liberalism. So Corchet writes, it would be impossible to sell Social Security like a normal financial product. So there are, of course, pension plans that exist in the private sector, and there are various formats of pension plans. There are defined benefit pension plans, which used to be more common. More often now, there are defined contribution plans. Think of 401k plans. But really, there are a variety of financial products that people could use for retirement planning. I would tend to agree that the Social Security system, the way it's designed today, wouldn't really emerge on the private market. And the main reason isn't because it's a defined benefit plan. I actually like defined benefit plans. I think it's because the politicians spend the money that is collected for Social Security now, and they pretend that there's a Social Security trust fund. In fact, it's an IOU. It's a giant IOU that the government writes to itself, the federal government, and then it uses current tax collections to pay the retirees. And that is not a sustainable system. So if the government were actually putting that money away into people's savings accounts, and there would be dedicated savings accounts for people who paid into Social Security, we would have a very different situation. But as it is right now, the federal government is engaging in exorbitant deficit spending in part to support the Social Security system. And if it stopped engaging in deficit spending, the Social Security system would collapse. And this whole idea that there is a reserve in the Social Security trust fund is an accounting fiction. It's all been borrowed against. And unfortunately, it is only a matter of time before that system fails the retirees, which is very sad. But we have Charlie now. Charlie, welcome.
Happy to be here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We can. And we can see you. So please tell us a bit about yourself as a musician, what inspired you to become a musician, and some of your journey, because you are one of those self-employed musicians who has made music into a career. And we have delved quite a bit into objectivist philosophy already in this stream. So following up from that, if you could also tell us about your interest in objectivism and how that came about, and perhaps some connections to your musical endeavors, that would be great as well.
Great. God, it's almost like we didn't just go through a pandemic here where we had to be like experts on setting all this stuff up. I guess my chops are a little low here for this kind of thing. So, well, if you asked my mom, she would say that I've been a truth seeker ever since I was like 5. I was always asking why, and that never changed. In both music and philosophy, I haven't quite found a way to marry them together. They're still very separate uh, passions and interests for me, but I do find music and philosophy to both be in the pursuit of truth and individual expression, and I find that in both. Um, as far as music goes, that was first. I'm 42, so I grew up in the 90s, and there was kind of a blues revival of like blues guitar with like Johnny Lang and Kenny Wayne Shepherd and others. And my mom would take me out to venues to see these guitar players, like bars and such. And they would pull all the stops. I mean, they would play with their teeth. They would play the guitar behind their back. They would light it on fire sometimes. I mean, it was and these players were like 18 years old, 20 years old. I was, 15. So for me, I just completely that was completely overwhelming and inspiring, and I wanted to do that. So that's what brought me to guitar. It was the blues first, and I would say that guitar is still the blues instrument, if there is one. It used to be piano, and before that it was banjo, but then guitar emerged as the blues instrument. So it was a great time for me to be exposed to that. Um, we were very poor, and I didn't have a brand new guitar, so one of my neighbors gave me a used guitar that the strings were very high off the guitar. It was very difficult to play. My fingers would bleed. And it was kind of like a trial by error. Like, let's see if this kid really wants to play guitar. And I did. I was able to learn songs. So this same neighbor, his name was Grizz, he quickly went on and bought me an electric guitar. So I was able to play some of these blues songs, and my mom would let me go down the hill. This is all out in the country. This is rural Southwest Wisconsin. She would let me wander down there and sit next to the old men who would have like fires every night, and they would play and strum and sing songs, and they would bend over backwards to show me how to play. And so that's how I got into a guitar, and I didn't find jazz until my mid 20s, I would say, and that was by listening to Miles Davis' Kind of Blue, which I think is the biggest selling jazz album of all time. At least it was. Um, and I found it mystifying at first. I did not understand why they were playing the notes they were playing. I didn't quite understand if it was all planned, how much of it was improvised. So I can very much remember, or I can relate to the experience of kind of novice jazz listeners. It's kind of overwhelming. It leads a lot of questions. So I started learning about jazz from this album, and here in Madison, where I live and teach and play, there was a club called Cafe Momar right next to the Capitol. And Monday nights, they would have half off bottles of wine and live jazz. And I would go there every Monday and I would listen to everyone play. And I was taking a college class at the time, like a jazz appreciation thing. So I interviewed the band members, and it just went from there. One thing went to another. I was using YouTube, learning from everyone I could, learning from recordings. I think that's very common with jazz musicians, is learning things by ear and being more of an ear player than a literature reading. I did not know how to read music until probably 10 years ago. Now I teach musical literacy. As far as philosophy, maybe to touch on that, I didn't find Ayn Rand or Objectivism until during the pandemic here in Madison. We were deeply affected by it, as I think a lot of the liberal hubs kind of left of the dial, places like Seattle. We had a total shutdown of the city. Restaurants and businesses were restricted on the number of guests they could allow, the capacity. We were also advised, how many people we could allow in our homes, in our private homes, things like that. And while that was going on, I was outraged by the top-down kind of governmental controls. It was very obvious to me that the authorities did not understand what this was, and they were just kind of grasping at straws and doing power grabs. And I seemed to be the only person who was bothered by that. So I started looking online, and first I found libertarian circles. I don't know if it was Tom Woods, maybe those types of channels, and they seemed to be in line with my feelings on the matter. And then eventually that led to Ayn Rand and Objectivism, and then I've just been learning ever since. So it's probably been about 4 years, going on 5 years since I've been studying that.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that overview. And indeed, your journey into music and philosophy are both quite fascinating. And in regard to music, I actually see a lot of parallels between your journey and that of our legislative director, Jason Geringer, who has joined us in this stream. Now, I'll highlight a few comments from Jason. First of all, he writes on Kenny Wayne Shepherd, he loves the Blue on Black tune, and he will be posting a blues tune soon called She's Gone. He also has a bit of a practical comment. When your fingers are hurting, you can use fingernail polish to keep going. So thank you for those remarks, Jason. And when you can get on camera, please feel free to chime in, because I do think you and Charlie have a lot in common. And looks like Jason is trying, but yes, Jason is very much a practical experimenter in the musical realm. Go ahead, Jason.
Well, what I'm mostly curious about is what brought you into jazz. I mean, I like blues. I like all kinds of music, but jazz. I don't know. I like it. It sounds cool, but I don't know. It always just seemed kind of like a jam band, kind of. I don't know. It seems different to me. I'm just curious what brought you to jazz. How did that happen?
Sure. Well, first, every jazz musician is a blues musician. Not every blues musician is a jazz musician. That's kind of as an aside. Blues is our language. It's our shared language. And I would also say that jazz, like blues, is a folk music. And I don't mean that as in, singing and strumming Bob Dylan kind of stuff. I mean it like as in it's passed down, and it's a vocal, it's a tradition. And it's taught from person to person, and it's not codified. And that's how jazz was until it became academized, to make up a word, in the 1970s, when you could take classes and learn how to play stuff. Now, universities throw out people with jazz degrees that can play exceptionally well and have an amazing technique. I mean, better than mine or anyone around here, but there seems to be an originality that's lost when you codify something like that. That's an art form. I don't think that's true of things like philosophy, of course, but what got me into jazz? Well, I always like a challenge, and I like an intellectual challenge. And when I heard Kind of Blue and other jazz albums in my 20s, I was just so mystified. I'm like, well, what is that? And I had to understand it. And I'm still trying to understand it in some ways. And so it's just, there seems to never be an end to it. Whereas, I love blues, don't get me wrong. But after I listen to blues for about 20 minutes, a half an hour, I feel very much like I understand what's happening and what people are doing. And it doesn't quite pique my imagination in the same way as jazz has.
Yes, thank you for that answer. And I think this is also a good time to discuss some of the key differences between jazz and classical music, because classical music, of course, is very much a formal tradition. It has a set of principles that have been codified or at least written about to a great extent, and some classical composers may kind of bend those principles a bit, but it's more of a system that starts with, let's say, written down notation, and then it gets performed, but it gets performed in a way that is as close to the composer's specifications as possible. So the composer says, these are the notes I want you to play. These are the kinds of accents that I want you to place on them. There is still some variation that a performer could bring to a piece, but within that kind of formal set of specifications. Whereas it seems jazz, as you pointed out, is more passed on from one musician to another, and there seems to be a bit more liberty for that subsequent musician to interpret it a bit differently. So where would you say the major differences lie?
Yes, to make an analogy, I would say, and I love classical music. That's what I listen to in the car mostly. Um, Classical music is like a documentary about somebody else's life, the way that they saw it. And in classical music, there's always a composer, right? They wrote the dynamic markings, like you mentioned, the details, the accents, all of that. So you're doing your best to basically not be an individual, but to play what they wanted you to play, what their vision was. But in jazz, it's about the individual. It's about my story. It's about how I'm feeling today. It's about the performer and how I practice, the things I like to do, how I interpret the piece. That is about the individual, I would say. So it's the difference between a documentary about someone where it's removed versus having a camera right on my shoulder that's following me around. So it's like real time. That's what I would say the difference is.
So
Yes.
do you improv a lot in jazz then?
Yes. There are different schools of so like there's like, free jazz it's referred to, which kind of started with Ornette Coleman in the late 50s in general. Um, this is where people kind of disagree, which is good. About how much improvisation is acceptable or tasteful in a performance. So like for me, I like about 60% improv, and I'm okay with up to 80%. But many musicians that I play with, they want less than that a lot of times. So I need to negotiate with them because I need them to be comfortable and I need them to be playing their best. So I may want 80% at a certain show and they might want 50%. And so I got to come to meet them. And I would also say that jazz is like democracy in musical form, in a sense, because it's about the individual. Like we all get to solo, but we're all supporting each other and we respect each other. And that brings out our solos. Each of our solos is us listening to each other and supporting each other. So I don't know if that gets to your question.
Yes,
No,
I think that's a great answer. Go ahead, Jason.
No, it did. That's really interesting. I think a lot of it might be just the fact that a lot of musicians just can't improv. It's like some comedians can't improv that good. You know what I mean? It's a unique skill to be able to do that, and I don't think a lot of people can do it at all. That's it.
Well, the great Sonny Rollins, who I have a lot of respect for, he's still alive. I think he's maybe 86, 87. He was there for the bebop movement through the swing era into the fusion era. He was there for all of it, and he says to this day that the thing, as we refer to it as, cannot be taught. And so that kind of goes back to what I was saying about academia and jazz being codified. For me, I spend a lot of my time, you know, I get the right brain, left brain always confused, but I spend it learning objective things, arpeggios, scales, bits of data, bits of information that are objective, that will arise in a musical setting. But then when I'm improvising, when I go to play, I'm not thinking about any of that. I'm able to completely forget about that. And I'm also neurodivergent. So for me, that's like relief. That's like peace for me. Whereas a lot of people, that would make them incredibly anxious and uncomfortable being put on the spot.
Very interesting. And I have often wondered, as a composer, but somebody who does not improvise, at least not yet, whether improvisation is a skill set that could be taught systematically, or whether it emerges more out of just being immersed in that musical world and dealing with music a lot, that you internalize certain concepts and are able to deploy them more readily, or certain skills that you're able to deploy more readily. So do you think you could, for instance, take a student maybe at a younger age and essentially teach them key principles of improvisation, or do they just have to play music a lot and then they'll learn kind of through immersion?
That's a great question. So people who play jazz and do it for a living, you have to listen to a lot of jazz. You have to listen to a lot of improv stuff. And again, those questions, why? Like, what did they play there? Why do I like that so much? Why did that sound so good? You have to investigate. And this is similar to philosophy. We have to be like investigative journalists here. Part of it is, though, you do also have to just study these people say it takes talent to do this. Oh, you're so talented, you must be so. But there are so many non-talented things that go into playing. It's 90% untalent. I mean, setting my alarm clock, getting my guitar out, tuning it, practicing scales, that's not talent. Listening to records, that's certainly not talent. Trying to play along with records and trying not to fall off the train, like try to start the song and end it with the musicians with no sheet music, or with or without sheet music. I wouldn't call that talent, right? It's investigative work. And once a certain level of comfortability is achieved, then I think we can start taking risks. So like in jazz, for instance, I don't play free jazz. I don't play free time and free meter and free key. When I play, I'm playing a tune that was usually written by somebody else, not always. And we agree on what key the song is in, what the tempo is, it's counted off. So that we know, we agree on. We agree about the song form. By song form, I mean, it's kind of like poetry, you know, iambic, pentameter, all that. Is it AABA song form? Is it AAB? Is it just AB? So we know kind of what events are going to occur. And in jazz, the art form, what it is it's laying down the rug for each other. It's saying, and here comes the chorus, and now I do this thing that makes it so that when you're playing, it sounds great. So we're referencing the form to each other. We're acknowledging it, and we're always referencing it and respecting it. So that kind of helps guide improvisation as well.
Yes, thank you very much for that answer. And if somebody wants to learn improvisation, what advice would you have for them?
Listen. Listen to, first off, find out what you like. That's not always obvious. Like maybe you like the sound of the trumpet, or maybe you like piano, you like the timbre of whatever instrument, or you like guitar. Once you find out what instruments you really like the sound of, those are the ones you should study, and those are the ones you should listen to and seek out those artists. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. And I also wanted to ask you, with regard to your entrepreneurial pursuits, you were a self-employed musician, and what was your journey like in terms of going from the beginnings when you were just getting started, just making your name known, to the point where you're able to support yourself through musical performances? What are some of the key principles that guided you, some of the challenges that you've had to overcome, and any advice you would have for people who want to pursue something similar?
Sure. Well, the pandemic was a bit of a blessing in this way. Um, so I started teaching at a brick and mortar music store, music shop that rented space for teachers in 2015. So going on 10 years. How I got the job is pretty interesting. A few years prior to being asked to work at this job, the phone rang one day, and it was somebody in our community, a local musician, and they said, "We're putting together an after-school like weekend kind of a get-together with students aged, like 8 years old to 18 years old, where they can experience music with professional gigging musicians." And they asked me if I was interested. I said yes, and I didn't have to read any sheet music for this. So it was wonderful. I got up super early. It was at a boys and girls club type situation, and we would just play together on stage, and there was no wrong. No one could do any wrong. No one could play anything wrong. And even us teachers, in order to demonstrate this, we would pick up instruments we've never played before and try to make sounds, basically look silly, being willing to look silly. And that made all the kids and the students feel comfortable taking risks as well. And so we ended up agreeing on some tunes, and we had a performance date, and we had a few weeks to get these kids, to get the ensemble where we could all perform. And it was kind of like a parents' night out kind of thing with food and all of that. It was just beautiful, the concept and everything about it. Just seeing young kids just fearlessly play on a stage, with very little music experience, that was eye-opening to me. And it showed me the possibility of music, that it's not this intellectual, it doesn't have to be that. And because of course I'm very prone to that, intellectualizing everything. So music both gets me into that and also gets me out of that. So fast forward a few years, a bass player that I played with here in Madison, he got a full scholarship to Northern Illinois University. And he had about 18 students at this local music store on bass and guitar. And he came up to me and he said, "I would like you to take over my position, my teaching position." And I said, "Well, that's great, but I don't know how to read music." And he said, "Oh, that's fine. Just stay one lesson ahead of each student, and you'll be all right." So I took the position. I was sweating bullets every day and every night for the first 2 months. Talk about humility. Trying to teach and making mistakes right along with the students. I emerged from that, a competent reader, and I teach music literacy, and I very much believe in that. And there's no contradiction either between being able to read music and having it in front of you, versus improvising. You can do both together. Although I prefer not having visually detaching. I think I do better because more of my resources are focused on the sound and playing when I don't have to visually track the song in real time for me. And I think that's true for most jazz musicians. So I'm teaching at this brick and mortar store for 5 years, and then the pandemic hit. When the pandemic hit, of course, all music in-person lessons were out of the question. The school closed down. They couldn't afford to pay their rent. So I started teaching on a Zoom, and I found quickly that I didn't need the school. I was actually teaching at 2 schools at that point. one on the west side, one on the east side, and I was biking to all these places. I was able to do this all on Zoom, and eventually in 2021, I took most of my students with me from the brick and mortar stores. And I also made an online profile through Thumbtack. And so I was able to advertise myself internationally. So I began teaching people through Zoom, in New York, people in New York, Utah, all over. And so that's how I was able to become self-employed. I was able to set my own wage and keep all of it. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Excellent. Well, thank you for describing your journey. And it's interesting how the shift to more electronic or virtual venues has actually helped catalyze many people's entrepreneurial careers, though sometimes not in the exact ways that one would have wished, since I think we all would have wished that there weren't a pandemic or a lockdown, but you turned that into an opportunity for yourself, and I commend you for that. Now, I also wanted to ask, and this is a question that has interested me. I've heard a lot of improvisational jazz, and I've often wondered, why wouldn't there be, for instance, a score created after an improvisational performance so that other people, if they liked it, if they enjoyed it, could re-perform it in a certain sense? But when I spoke to certain jazz musicians about that, the concept seemed kind of anathema to them, even though, of course, in classical music, there's pretty much always a score. There can be classical improvisations as well, but the improvisations do get written down sometimes and at times transformed in certain ways into more formal compositions. But in jazz, that often doesn't happen. So if a particular jazz musician is known for certain improvisations, certain recordings, and one can hear those recordings sometimes even from decades ago, but if the recording happens to be lost, there often isn't a way to reconstruct that necessarily because there isn't a score. So if you could comment on the differences in terms of, let's say, the codification of music between classical and jazz, I think that would be enlightening to a lot of our viewers.
Yes. At some point during the pandemic, I think it was 2020 or 2021, some group recorded Miles Davis' Kind of Blue, that album that inspired me, note for note. The exact same instruments, the exact same tempo, everything. I have yet to listen to that album. I just have no interest in listening to it. Maybe you can listen to it. I can't think of the name of the group, but you could probably Google those details that I mentioned. To test the theory, to test what you're saying, to see, does it sound the same? Does it feel the same subjectively? To play the exact same notes that somebody did on a rainy night in 1959, for instance, playing those same notes and everything in 2020. I'm mildly interested in that, but I don't, like you said, it's anathema because jazz is so contextual with the moment that it's happening and how those musicians are feeling. Just like the beginning of this conversation, I was experiencing all kinds of technical difficulties. And so I tried to make a joke about how we just went through a pandemic and we're all supposed to know how to do this, and it didn't work. I wouldn't have said that if things went differently, if everything was on time. The story would have, the interview, all of this would have started differently. I probably would be talking slower than I am now, all of it. And so I consider jazz to be, it's about expression. And what are people expressing? They're expressing their feelings and their thoughts, and those things are contextual with the times. So I think all jazz is modern jazz because it's played right now. Even if it's a tune that was written in 1925, when we're playing it with people today, it sounds modern. It can't sound like the way it did then, because there's just too many factors that go into it. I mean, an individual's health. Are we late to the gig? Is the drummer rushing tonight? Does the bass player have a headache? Have I been listening to such and such an artist a lot lately, so that I'm kind of playing like that artist because I'm thinking more like they are? That's something that I'll often do when I'm performing. I'll think about the artist who wrote the tune. Like, what would they say right now? What would they be playing? It's kind of like character acting, like method acting in film. I'll think like that, and yeah, I feel like I'm losing the original question. I don't know if that gets to it.
I think I kind of get what he was talking about earlier, though, to where you just sort of feel like that there's X amount of bars in the verse, and then it's going to go to the chorus, right? And it reminds me of Jim Morrison, how he used to go off in improv a lot, and he used to bug the drummer, which I can understand because the drummer's got to know that stuff. But if that the chorus is coming, or you're in the chorus and it's supposed to end and you don't, well, then you're going to go another 4 bars or another 8 bars or whatever, and then you're just going to catch the next one. So I think I get how you would do that, sort of, if you know the tune already, and if you already know like the changes from the chorus, or from the verse to the chorus. If you know when that changes, you just kind of, yeah, I sort of get it. So
If I could make another analogy, because I think music really lends itself to different analogies. When we're watching like a sporting event, like I'm not a big sporting fan, but like football or baseball or basketball, the reason why people enjoy that so much is because we're looking for events. We're anticipating certain events happening. Oh, there was an interception. Now the other team has it. Oh, they're going to make it. Maybe they're going to make a touchdown. We know kind of what each team is trying to do, what the positions mean, what the realm of possibilities are within each thing. And so that provides interaction and interest. People are interacting. And that is similar to jazz because that's happening in real time. And we don't really know what's going to happen. I might only solo 1 or 2 choruses, or I might look at the bass player and point, and the bass player solos first, even though I played the melody first. That's unexpected. So the audience is expecting one thing. They're expecting me to solo first, and because I played the melody, I introduced the tune. But that might not always happen. Or I might take a short solo, and then I might trade with the drummer. I might trade 4s or 8s. And so there are all these realms of possibilities of interaction that can happen in real time, much like a sporting event. But in order for it to be like a sporting event, people have to know how to listen to it. And I find that people like myself in my 20s are mystified by jazz, and they don't quite know how to listen. They don't know what to listen for. And so, like you were just saying, knowing the form of the song, that this is 24 bars, it's AAB. I'm listening to their solo and I'm trying to anticipate if they're going to keep soloing, if they're going to go for another chorus, or if they're going to hand it off. That would be an analogy to a sporting event. Are they going to pass the ball? Or are they going to run it up the court? Are they going to go for it?
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much for that explanation. So, by the way, I did find the album in question, which is the note-by-note recreation of Miles Davis, and I am going to post the link to that. It's interesting, too, because the quartet that did that has a name, Mostly Other People Do the Killing. So rather unusual name, to say the least, but I will most certainly listen to it and form my impressions and listen to the original Miles Davis. But this is the link to their Bandcamp page where one can both listen to and purchase the digital album. I have one more question about jazz performance, and then I think it would be good to hear some of the demonstrations that you had prepared. But this is about audience behavior. So I am very much a classically trained audience member. So when I go to a classical concert, for instance, the expectation is the audience doesn't participate at all, except at the end when there's applause. And indeed, quite often orchestras have to make an effort to inform people for multi-movement works that one does not clap between the movements, and one has to have an expectation of how many movements will there be, say in this symphony or in this sonata, so when a movement ends one doesn't just erupt into applause. And certainly one does not clap or make any sort of noise whatsoever during the performance of a classical work. In jazz recitals, however, I've often heard, for instance, if somebody plays a solo and it's a particularly skillful solo, the audience not only claps, but is expected to clap. And that is a different way of listening. For a classically trained audience member, that does seem a bit, let's say, outside of their comfort zone, because with classical music, one really wants to hear each individual note. And sometimes I feel if somebody's applauding, if somebody's doing anything other than just sitting still, that's not conducive to hearing the sounds of the performance. But with jazz, it seems there's a different outlook. So maybe you could speak to that audience participation or lack thereof, when it's expected, why it's expected, and your experience with that. And are there maybe differences among types of jazz performances in this regard?
Great question. So even Miles Davis said this, jazz is social music. So jazz has a lot more Africa in it than European classical music. This is one thing that I love about jazz is like a nuclear reactor. It takes everything in its environment. So pop, classical, ballet, folk music, blues, rock. It takes all of these things in, and then it spits out something that is other. And that's why I think jazz also will prevail, will never go away, because it's constantly taking in what's going on around it. If you see a show in Africa, for instance, if you attend a concert, people are talking constantly. People are yelling, they're shouting, they're laughing. They will let you know if you do a good job. And if you don't, if they don't like it, you will know, and they will ignore you. That's what I've heard. I've never been, but that would ring true with the experience of it being social music versus it being, I'm going to have my army listen to this scale. We're going to use this particular scale, right, in the time of Plato. My army is only going to listen to this scale because this is good for their morale. And we're only going to use music for certain traditions, or for just, listening, for very serious instrumental kind of uses, versus it being kind of like, do you like it? Do you not like it? Let us know. Definitely different than classical music. I definitely agree there. It can be even distracting for me as a performer, because I'll be playing and people will be clapping off beats, very bad, and maybe in the front row, And now all my resources are that just I have to concentrate even harder on what's happening, which is not bad. It's great for my listening because I have to concentrate even harder. But that can be a distraction. Also for people in the audience who just want to listen and they don't want to sit next to somebody who's clapping, whether it's on beat or off beat. But one thing to keep in mind about jazz is, there was an African diaspora. There was it's American music. Like jazz is American music. That's another thing that I love about it. because they were all of these immigrants from all over Europe, Cuba, Latin America, a lot of the Latin forms of jazz. They're informed by not just Africa. It's a melting pot of music. And of course, you know, it's those cultures are different. They are more loud socially about things, and in social situations, they laugh loud. They tell jokes loud. There's, you know, so I think, yeah, that definitely plays out in jazz.
Yes, thank you. That is indeed a fascinating difference, and we have some interesting comments in this regard. So Alan Crowley notes that yes, there is post solo clapping, and also when there's a good change in the music executed by the band, for instance, a key or meter change. And Mike Lazine points out that this is also the same with rock, pop, R&B, and even EDM. And in regard to the lack of scores, he writes that it is the same deal with EDM. There are no compositions or score sheets. That is why if someone emulates someone else, it is many times by ear. So thank you. That is quite interesting, Mike. And now, Charlie, I know you had some ideas for demonstrations using your guitar, and let's see if we can fit those in. As long as the sound will carry, I think that will be of interest to our audience.
Cool.
Well, I just happen to have my guitar here. This is what I teach on. This instrument is not what I perform with, for a couple of reasons. It's harder to play. The neck is wider. It's thicker. And the second reason is it's not loud enough to play with drums and a bass, even if it's mic'd up and plugged into the amp, just like the electric guitar. It'll feed back, and the acoustical properties of this instrument will not come through. It'll just kind of sound half-ass acoustic, half-ass electric is what it'll sound like. So, but for teaching and low volume settings like this, it's pretty instructional. I think it's good. Acoustic instruments have what I call like a 3D kind of sound to them. Depends on where you're sitting in the space and all of that. So here's another pandemic story. Back in 2020, when all of my gigs got canceled because of not just the shutdown, but the local ordinances, basically stopping restaurants and bars, basically reducing their capacity to 25% at the lowest, up to 50%. And they adjusted this multiple times. They would go down to 25%, and then a new strain would come out, or it'd go down to 50%, a new strain would come out. Then they would reduce it down to 25. And then sometimes it would go up to 75. So my calendar was very unsteady. So my response to that was to go back to school, to go online and do some investigation. And I found Jordan Clemens out of New York, adjunct professor, jazz guitar professor. He has something called melodic triads. And I've been with his program ever since, so over 4 years now. And it's completely changed the way that I approach improvisation, melody, harmony. And I also teach my students. I develop my own curriculum based on this understanding. And I have 2 semesters of materials prepared. And it's working. It's working. It's working for adults and kids. Basically, in brief, instead of learning scales like we all learn in school, music school, that's very European tradition. Hopefully you can hear me okay. There's 7 notes there. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. We even use vowels that are not English. I think that's French. So we have this solfege system, and we have 7 notes. That's odd, for sure. Because our music is in 3 for the most part, groupings of 3 or 2. or 4. So why 7? So in my investigations before I found Jordan Clemens in this thing, his program, I ran into a piano player, a bebop piano player online named Barry Harris. And he developed a system where he says the major scale is wrong. He says this is folk music now. See, this wasn't codified. He says that there's actually 8 notes, that 7 is wrong, and I'll play it for you with the 8 notes. Let's hear that 8th note in there. Whoops. So he says that's right, because that fits 4/4. It fits the structure of our music that we're playing. So if we're playing 8th notes or quarter notes or 16th notes, we'll always land on a strong chord tone on a strong beat. So just in case I'm talking over people's heads, generally in classical music and blues and jazz and pop, the strong beats are considered beats 1 and 3, and the weaker beats are 2 and 4. So our major scale, our 7-note scale, it doesn't work. You end up having to make adjustments rhythmically to land on a strong beat with a strong chord tone. I'm playing a G scale, by the way. So with Barry's scale, it was strong, weak, strong, weak, strong, weak, strong, weak, strong. So that the notes of the G triad are on beats 1 and 3. Triad, 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 triad. That's actually, and he said that, you notice there's 4 notes that are lining on good beats, you might be wondering. He said that the 6th chord is actually the consonant chord in music. It's not the major 7th. So a triad with a note a half a step below the root, that's a major 7 chord. So that's a major 7 chord. He says that that's wrong. He said that that major 7th note is actually a diminished note. It's actually a tension note. It's not a consonant note. And I agree with that. I call it the I gotta go pee note. That note demands relief. That note demands resolution. So when you add it into a chord, he said that it's just, so what he proposes is to play a 6th chord. So that's where that other note is. So that's a 6th chord, G6. Root, 5th, 6th, and there's the 3rd of the chord. It's not a triad, it's a chord now, I guess, because it has 4 notes. So now listen to the scale again. So I thought that was very interesting. So I studied his system and I learned he has 4 scales that he plays, this piano player. All of his compositions, his improvisation, he says it can all be done using 4 8-note scales. Now, I went with that for a while, but when I found Jordan Clemens and the New York City Melodic Triads program, my brain exploded, because now the way that I see music is, the triad is the smallest unit of information that's happening at any time in a composition. It doesn't matter if it's pop, jazz, classical. And by triad, I mean like a 3-note. There are major triads. G, like we just played. G minor, where we flat the 3rd. There's augmented triads, which are less common. That's where we raise the 5th. We have diminished triads. Those are more common than augmented. We have sus triads. Those are less common again. That covers about 95, 99% of triads right there that I just played. Jordan's program views the triad, not the scale, not the 7-note scale or the 8-note or the 9-note. The 3-note thing is the thing. So those three notes, I'll just keep talking about G, just one triad at a time. Let's say we're playing a song in G, or we're playing a G chord right now in a song. Those three notes are going to be the pillars at that time, the stable notes. And all the other 9 notes, because there's 12 notes in Western tonal music, for those who don't know, all the other 9 notes are all tension notes. And they all have their own personality. They all have their own character, like characters in a play. And I'll demonstrate that right now. This is something I wanted to demonstrate. This is tension 2, we call it. It's an A note if you're playing a G triad and you throw in an A note. Do you hear the tension in that 4th note that I added? I just kept playing G, A, B, D, G, A, B, D. That's all I played. I'll play it again. We call it kind of the Eeyore note, the, I don't know, like kind of question mark note, like, Whoops. See how it resolves, how that A note resolves to the B or the G? Listen to it again. It resolves to that. So you can do that with all the other 9 notes, with all the other 8 notes, I guess, at this point, to develop a relationship and an ear for hearing the different tension notes over any triad, which I said it was the smallest unit in music. The bass player is playing the triad notes. The piano player is playing the triad notes, perhaps in their left hand. Or the melody. If you listen to things like Bach, a lot of passages are like 70 to 80% triad notes. There's some Bach song that does that. I forget which was probably a violin thing. That was all triad notes. The 1, the 3, the 5. Here's another tension note. This one is the flat 2. And this one is kind of diabolical. It's kind of nefarious. It's naughty. There it is again. So you might want to use that in certain environments. We have the whiny tension 4. Well, it's a whiny baby. Well, wants to go down to that B note. Well, the pop song totally capitalizes on that tension note. If you know Blister in the Sun by the Violent Femmes, or if you heard that lick before, that's a triad with tension 4, we would say. And notice how that note keeps wanting to go down to the stable B note, the 3rd. There's tension 2. So that's how we would analyze music, is by identifying the tension notes. Another thing that this program taught me, to wrap up quick, is notes and music behave completely differently when they're horizontally being played, so like in melody or in a solo, versus vertical. Now, our college system, as I know it, teaches that all the notes all have a place and they don't change from that place. So like the root is the root, the 3rd always sounds like the 3rd, the 5th, that the notes in a scale, they all kind of have a role and they don't leave that role. And it's the same whether you're stacking notes on a piano or a guitar or whatever, or you're soloing. That's actually not true. I can actually make the root note of a chord sound like the wrong note based on the notes that I played before it. That's a little more difficult to demonstrate here. Let me see. Let's see, actually. Right now, imagine this G note is ringing. This note this sounds like a blue note, this G note in this context. It's the same note that I was playing here. Because I played these other notes, this sharp, this nefarious G sharp note that I played earlier, the diabolical one, it actually sounds like a bluesy note. Doesn't that sound different than when I play? It's the same note. But in this context, it sounds like a diabolical note. But if this is in the bass, see how it sounds like the bluesy 5 to this D note because of what I'm maybe not doing a very good job of demonstrating that. But notes behave and interact differently in a horizontal context. And so we call that the melodic progression. So when you're learning a tune or a jazz standard or whatever, there are the set changes of the song that the composer wrote or that we agree upon. And then when you're soloing or improvising, you can create your own melodic progressions that fit the way that you feel that you want to, what you want to present. You can do that in real time with improv through this melodic triads program. So thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. And a few comments or observations from our audience. So when you played the 8-note scale, Alan Crowley observed that it sounded like there was a flat that was inserted in there. And I'm curious, which flat would it be, or sharp, on a G major scale? And if you were to do it on a C major scale, which note would you add?
Sure. That's the sharp 5 or the flat 6 that was added. That's the tension note that we add. And the reason why Barry Harris, why this is kind of logical, I mean, it's a great system. It's not the one that I teach or that I'm using, but what this basically does is, let's see. Yeah, it creates a tension in between scale degree 5 and scale degree 6. So in the C major scale, that would be, see, I just did it there, G sharp. I played a C, D, E, F, G, G sharp, A. And that makes it in such a way, it makes the scale so that if you're playing that scale, that 8-note scale in chords, it ends up being tonic, diminished, or dominant. In Barry's system, they're more or less the same. Everything comes from diminished. It's tonic, diminished, tonic, diminished, tonic. So consonants, dissonance, consonants, dissonance. Here it is again in G, just really quickly. Here's G6. Here's our D7, our diminished. Here's our next G chord. There's that flat 6, there's that sharp 5 right there. But then that resolves to the 6. There's our diminished again. Now we're back to tonic sound. There's our diminished or dominant sound, and we're back to tonic. So home, away, home, away, home, away is what we're expressing there through consonance and dissonance.
Yes, very interesting. Thank you. And I did think it would be G sharp in the C major scale, D sharp in the G major scale. So I appreciate the confirmation of that. And also, Jason notes it's interesting how some notes sound like an emotion, and he wonders what makes a note sound sad. Why do minor chords, for instance, sound sad? Alan Crowley writes, it's not how one note sounds, it's the note in context. The Danny B series points out that C minor is his favorite key, and he thinks it's definitely a sad key. It's interesting too. I have created compositions where I go back and forth between C minor and C major, and that's fairly easy to do, to transition between those two keys. But definitely C minor, it is kind of one of the darker minor keys, I would say. But I wonder what you would have to say about the conveyance of emotion in music and specific devices to do that. To Jason's question, what is it in particular that makes a particular combination of notes sound sad versus, say, uplifting or vigorous or any other emotion that you would associate with it?
Well, I'm not quite a musicologist, but I do find these questions interesting. And as I said earlier, this is one of the things why I keep learning, and I feel like it's this endless thing, because there's only 12 notes. There shouldn't be, if you think there's only 12 notes, if there's only 12 notes, why are there dozens and dozens of tonalities that exist? Even with those 9 tension notes, when we combine them in different ways, we end up with all of these different emotions. So it's even more, of course, than the 9 characters in the play. A G7 flat 9, it has a certain sound, but a G7 flat 9 with a flat 5 has a different sound. A G7 flat 9 with a sharp 4 and a natural 5 has a different emotion. I think I've counted before. I think there's at least 12 kinds of dominant chord, which is, considered to be the most dissonant chord in music ever since classical, and maybe even before the official classical period. People were experimenting with these kind of things, with consonance and dissonance. That I find interesting. The history of there was a time when the diminished 5 was considered, right, the devil's interval, I believe, and it wasn't allowed in composition because people didn't know how to deal with it. They didn't know how to resolve it. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, if I'm playing a G7, let's just stick with G, it's this interval, and it's up here, and it's up here if I continue it, and it's up here. That is certainly a dissonance. It's not the most comfortable sounding thing, but it took us hundreds of years to figure out, how do I resolve that. And that's what you hear in classical music. You hear diminished fifths all the time, but it resolves to a minor 6. The diminished fifth resolves. And then down here, if I play it in this octave, it resolves to a major 3rd. Listen. So once we figured that out, composers started throwing dominant chords left and right until, around the mid 1800s, late 1800s. There was quite a few dominant chords in music, and music became more and more dissonant. And of course, I find that history interesting. Jazz has had similar kind of evolution, where it becomes more dissonance, almost to a saturation point, and then it backs off and it becomes less dissonance and all of that. More basic, then more complicated, then more basic. That seems to happen in genres of music besides jazz and classical too.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. And I have often said that what makes some music perhaps more jarring to the ear is not dissonance per se, it's unresolved dissonance. And if you know how to resolve the dissonance, then it can play a role in a musical piece such that the listener actually doesn't have an issue with it. The listener can take it in the context of the rest of the composition or the rest of the melody that's being played. So thank you very much, Charlie. And we have about 14 minutes left in our salon, so I want to make sure we get into some of the philosophical topics that you wanted to discuss. And one of them, and this will be broadly phrased, would be your outlooks on Ayn Rand's opinions as contrasted with objectivists' doctrine, as you put it, or let's say more formal or more stable objectivist thought. One aspect that I pointed out before you came on is not everything that Ayn Rand articulated in terms of her personal views necessarily would be an integral part of objectivist philosophy. Like if she liked a certain composer and didn't like another composer, that wouldn't be objectivist philosophy as such. That would be her personal preferences. And somebody could be a person who espouses objectivist philosophy and yet have different musical tastes from Ayn Rand. So where would you draw that distinction in your understanding between Ayn Rand's opinions and objectivism as a body of thought?
Yeah, in Ayn Rand's Q&A sessions in particular, there are many clips that have been taken out of context, such as her talking about the Native Americans here and the founding of this country, things about war, which I believe you covered in one of your YouTube videos about objectivism. I think you said strengths and weaknesses, perhaps, was the title.
Yes.
Yeah, I definitely think that. Well, first off, I mean, Ayn Rand was not a jazz fan, so that's out the window. She wasn't a fan of beards on men. Of course, you're out the window, and I've had a beard much of my adult life. Things like that are not objectivist doctrine. Her view on homosexuality, her view on that, and I would imagine her views on being trans. I imagined. The thing about Ayn Rand is she wasn't quite willing. I mean, this shows her genius. For someone born in 1905, she wasn't willing to say on record whether homosexuality was a mental disorder or a neurosis, which I think that's pretty progressive considering that homosexuality was listed in the DSM as a psychological disorder. I would like to say until 1993, but it might have been the 80s. But nonetheless, someone born in 1905 saying that, I think it shows her intelligence and the fact that psychology, for instance, is a different field than philosophy. And yes, psychology relates to philosophy. They relate to each other because, as Leonard Peikoff had said, philosophy is the study of fundamentals. So certain questions she had opinions on certain issues. Another one she had said is that she would never vote for a female for president. And I don't quite remember what Q&A or where she said that at, but that's been recited to me many times. Of course, I don't agree with that at all. Her rationality for that was that men should not serve under women. Men are not to serve under women. Of course, she had views about masculine and feminine in her novels that was played out and that she had also elaborated on. Some of which I agree with that. But what if a female objectivist was running for president? Would Ayn Rand not vote for her for president? I have a hard time believing that. And yes, I certainly don't agree with that. What else? that's what comes to mind, I guess, right away. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for that. And as someone who voted for a woman for president, not Hillary, Jo Jorgensen in 2020, I definitely do not agree with the idea that a woman couldn't be a quite capable president. I think as an individualist, people need to be judged based on their outlooks, their histories, their qualifications as individuals. So I do think, though, the vast majority of our culture today has come to accept that as well. And of course, in 2020, I wish I could have voted for her. Liz Parrish was our vice presidential nominee for the Transhumanist Party, but Nevada does not allow write-ins. So I went with the next best choice, which was Jo Jorgensen. But I also wanted to ask about your thoughts on contemporary culture in terms of philosophy, because you had some ideas in this regard that you wanted to share. So from a philosophical standpoint, how would you characterize various phenomena in our culture today? I know that's a broad question for the 8 minutes we have remaining, but perhaps a few thoughts in that regard would be of interest.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I follow the Yaron Brook channel, and he stated it this way. He said that the left and the right at large, basically everybody agrees on morality for the most part. It's just a matter of who needs to be sacrificed to who and how much. And I certainly agree with that. In terms of politics, the left and the right both have made the creators of wealth, the millionaires, the billionaires, they're basically the scapegoat, as well as capitalism is the scapegoat for our problems as humanity, not just as a country, but that capitalism is a non-sustainable. Well, first off, we don't, society at large doesn't understand what capitalism even means. They believe that what we have now, which I would call crony capitalism, or it's a mixed economy, I think most objectivists would use that terminology, is of course a mixture of social healthcare, socialized this and that, fascism. We have tariffs, very expensive tariffs, like on iPhones, for instance, on electric cars. Collectivism, various forms of collectivism, which basically states that the individual does not exist for itself. The individual exists as a sacrificial unit to society or to the greater good. And of course, even Bernie Sanders believes in a greater good. So does AOC. So does Trump would probably say there's a greater good. Biden, all of these people, we all pretty much agree that in order to make things right, someone needs to be sacrificed to somebody else. And so, of course, this is counter to Ayn Rand's ethics that says that I exist for myself. I don't exist to serve a creator or a president, a political state. My life exists as an end in itself. And that's why individual rights are important, as well as a free market, so that I can choose for myself what my values are freely, that I can vote with my dollar versus the government placing things like price controls and taxes that warp what the value of things are so that the market cannot function. So you said philosophically, this is more politics. I'm on the top layer now. But I would say philosophically, we're also quite lost. I would say that the left is mostly Kantian. Even if they've never read any Kant, they don't know who he was. I would say that most of the policies are reflecting a duty-based servitude that people need to follow. It's not good to be prideful. It's not good to be a warrior. It's not good to live for yourself. There are these imperatives that we have to fulfill to live in a society, which include giving up. I mean, you saw this during the pandemic. It was completely clear to me how society thinks this. There was very little difference between the left and the right. I'll give an example. So some people have compromised immune systems. And if they contracted the COVID virus, whether they were vaccinated or not, of course, some of these people couldn't even be vaccinated because their immune system may not be able to handle the effects of the spike protein and all that. Because these people exist and live among us, we all need to be restricted about where we can go, on wearing a mask, on whether I should be vaccinated for my. So it's not even about that I get vaccinated for myself to protect myself, which is the point of having a vaccine. It's actually more about other people. It's actually more that I should get the vaccine regardless of what it does to me or how I feel about it. It's for everybody else. So the individual was subverted. So basically, we take the lowest denominator. We take people with compromised immune systems or the elderly who maybe have 5 years left to live or less. And we're going to subvert the rest of society to these people. And so we all need to behave as if everywhere we go, everything we do, the minute we go out the front door, we're possibly risking the lives of these people. In the society and economics were shut down as a result of this. And we're paying for it, and our children will pay for it, and the young people are paying for this. So that became very clear to me. Of course, this is now I'm back. I've made a circle. This is back to where I was investigating libertarian ideology and ideas. And then I found Ayn Rand and then Objectivism through that. People didn't have ideas. Politicians did not have ideas. No one had ideas about how we should handle this pandemic. For instance, the idea of using hotels, like open, spare hotel rooms to house people who are infected, to quarantine people, that idea didn't come from a politician. Our politicians had no ideas other than to stay home, don't go out, have everything ordered, clean your groceries off, get vaccinated, and don't question anything. And don't even talk about immunity. Even people who talked about immunity were canceled by the left and the right. So I look at it as a duopoly, two sides of a collectivist coin, and it needs to be challenged on a philosophical and moral basis.
Yes, indeed. And of course, in the US Transhumanist Party, we are strongly in favor of challenging the duopoly, and we see more similarities than differences among the views that are put forward by the dominant political parties and the left and right cultural factions that they represent. Now, our vice presidential candidate, Daniel Tweed, is in the chat, and he wrote, "Don't like the rich. When was the last time a poor person gave you a job?" And he also points out that free markets can create new wealth without anyone having to lose existing wealth. And this is a very important aspect of our outlook in the Transhumanist Party. We have a positive sum view of the world. We believe that people create new value, and they don't have to take value from anybody else. And really, if there is one key takeaway in terms of how we relate to objectivism in the Transhumanist Party, not every one of our members is an objectivist, and some most clearly are not, but we believe in a positive sum view of the world. And we do not want to take from anybody. We do not want to diminish anybody's share of the metaphorical pie. We want to grow the pie for everyone through the progress of science and technology, but also entrepreneurship, the creativity of individuals. And I think what you bring to our society as a musician, as an innovator, is exceptionally valuable. And artists and musicians more generally are a key component of this vision of essentially individualistic progress, where we all benefit from the creations of people who are free to bring them forth into this world. So thank you very much, Charlie, and I'll echo the sentiments of our friend Alan Crowley. Thank you for coming on. It's nice to have a broad discussion of philosophy and music, and I'm sure all of our viewers learned quite a bit from having you as our guest. And I think we need to unmute you, Charlie, for...
Oh, yes. Thank you very much. I appreciate those kind words, and thanks again for having me.
Indeed. And I hope that we all enjoyed Charlie's commentary and his demonstrations, and that we can all live long and prosper.